Our relationship's roots run deep, yet its branches spread thin, truncated by greed and pride. Still, its fruits remain abundant and ripe.
Metaphorical extension is the process of taking a concept and using it as a descriptive scheme in a sentence or proposition. Like we used tree in the foregoing sentence. We see that common properties of tree are being used here as a way of making the object of the sentence more expressive. This is a common and very useful literary method. In fact, good writing is a phrase invented to express this literary device as the model for all forms of writing. A reason that may strike you as paradoxical, given what's been said. The reason is that metaphorical extension, though a staple in the domain of literature and poetry, is no more literary than coding is merely typing, or painting merely brushing a canvas with certain colors. It is a faculty and often skill, techne, that we cannot do without in language. It is an art, as Kant says, hidden in the depths of the human soul, an art the true manipulations of which we will be hardly likely ever to guess from nature, and to have opened before our eyes. Language is almost entirely metaphorically extended. Extended in the same way Descartes thought space was extended so that it contained no vacuum or vacancy anywhere. In a sense, this is true. To think of an empty space is to immediately fill this supposedly empty space with content, namely the present thought of the space. My beholding a presumably empty section of space places me in it and renders it no longer empty. In much the same way, every act of speech, every word is a metaphor. It represents an aspect of the world, in the sense that the meaning of a word is never exhausted in any instance of its use. It always seems to point beyond itself. We know it by the term context, defined in Merriam-Webster as the interrelated conditions in which something exists or occurs, environment or setting. We can't so much as think without a context. The context is something that comes before and foregrounds our thought and by extension language. This context can be anything, a color, a mood, a shape, whatever it is. It would serve that same function as tree does in the foregoing example, where we saw tree helped in articulating the theme friendship organically, in a way which no other substance could. Here it seems that friendship mimics trees in the pattern of its development and articulation, only that, and this is a big disclaimer, it's not mimicry, but that friendship here really is tree-like. Tree is the underlying concept by means of which we are able to perceive maturation or any pattern of growth that involves maturation. Not that maturation and trees share this relation incidentally. Treeness here is what Kant would call a transcendental schema. It is that third function that mediates and makes possible the application of pure concepts of the understanding to appearances. As he says, this mediating representation must be true, that is, free from all that is empirical, and yet be intellectual on the one side and sensible on the other. Such a representation is the transcendental schema. The meaning which the phrase acquires when expressed metaphorically is evidence as to the reality of that which the experience is illustrated through. What's noteworthy here is that whenever a metaphorically extended concept is used, it always changes the course of the proposition and its overall sense. It's never the proposition that changes it. The proposition merely provides the material or the manufactured articles which the metaphor then molds into a certain shape. The innate properties of substances of nature appear to have a metaphysical being with tremendous expressive power, helping us express ideas that vernacular or regular speech can only hint at. There is a sense in which the substances of nature have a being, that everything that belongs to nature has a being which we can intellectually master and use as a solution to certain problems. This is a complicated extension of the idea. However, it becomes given if we somehow adjust our cosmological worldview so as to see its teleological nature. That is, to see the final causes of things rather than their accidents, and see that each component in this universe retains a tendency to its natural place, prescribed to it by its property, even after it has been forcibly deprived of this place. This way we can approach the various teleologies of nature as various solutions to various existential and ontological problems. That, for example, we owe to treeness the ability to conceive the genealogical side of things. The concept of maturation, which is related to genealogy, is the real mental representation of the being of the tree more than its physical nature, and not a fiction devised by language out of convenience. Metaphorical extension is the application of the being of something to the being of another. This operation is abstract, inasmuch as language consists of terms that are abstractions of real physical processes. This line of reasoning inevitably leads to questions as to the nature of language and its overall utility, and the answer is found in its ability to perform abstractions of real-world processes, and combine said abstractions in a manner that could never be realized in physical reality due to the obvious limitations of the laws of physics. To modify one idea by another, for example, for a situation to be sticky or to have been under the weather, are the parts of language for which it's most valued. It's an almost alchemical process, aptly describing operations that are more nuanced than can be seen or sensed. Rather, these relations are purely intuitional or platonic, the sort of relations that literary devices and poetry emerged out of. These relations stem from the same world to which we return when we feel pressured to use examples, analogies, allusions, and comparisons to help articulate ideas. In this world, what an idea is an infinite thing, individual yet capable of the greatest diversity. The image of a triangle, writes Kant, can never be adequate to the concept of a triangle in general. It would never attain that generality of the concept which makes it applicable to all triangles. In other words, the actual representation of a triangle in a mathematical graph is not the triangle itself, but only one of the ways in which it can be represented. This explains Plato's meaning that the world of the senses, the world we see, is just a pale copy of that true and unchanged world of the forms. This is because perception is occasional and focal. You can only see the instances of things. It builds the concept of triangle after seeing an acute, equilateral, degenerate, and right-angled triangle. It recognizes triangularity in specific figures, and though it may seem that it's the object that gives the impression of triangularity, or that it's this quality that belongs to it, it's also the observer in the active recognition configures the object based on prior acquaintance with the general concept. A triangle here is used as a general program by which to designate and distinguish, in the objects of experience, those which fit certain descriptions. But this procedure is not to be sought empirically, that is, in how objects physically affect one another, but in our ability to actually embody the objects intellectually, to imagine them. The focus thus shifts from observing the object to actually using the object intellectually by metaphorical extension. This is the mode of being called readiness at hand. By thinking of anything, save language genealogically, we're actually using the tree as our schema. The worldview that results is one which represents language in its development from other earlier languages, i.e., any explanatory model that relies on concepts of chains and links, branches and inheritance, employ, knowingly or not, the metaphorical extension of the tree that's already built into us. It seems somehow that higher principles of nature have a certain affinity to our mind and reasoning, that the case can be made that certain literary devices can be traced back to real physical substances in relation to which they can be interpreted as attributes, as German physicist Carl Newman held in his theory of the body alpha, a description of which goes,
Only in a world in which there exists at an unknown point of space an absolutely rigid body, unchanging in its form and dimensions to all time, are the propositions of our mechanics intelligible.
Newman applies the same concept to the phenomenon of motion. According to this view, inasmuch as all genealogical processes are traceable to the tree, and as such render tree their most appropriate symbol, so is motion itself traceable to a substance. Newman suggests, in reference to which the laws of mechanics are intelligible, and that could serve as their most appropriate and perfect symbol. Call these perfect symbols pure substances in contrast to Kant's pure concepts. Now, assuming that there is an affinity, why should there be any? And how far does it go? Having conceptualized an idea and established its basic precepts, we're now able to direct it, like the lens of a camera, towards the external world. We technically embody the concept, we vectorize it, and as a result it becomes a parameter and therefore a rule that modifies our experience. We do this all the time. When we look for things, we have a prefigure or description of what we're looking for. We can add to this fact that metaphorical extension only applies to pure substances, which is plausible. However, evidently, this does not mean that it does not apply to individual properties or aspects of the pure substance. For example, deriving a scheme from the word fruit or leaf. We see here that both concepts, though derivatives of the tree, are no less meaningful and valid. Now, the ability to dictate the nature and course of experience by determining its object is how metaphorical extension proceeds in general. The caveat here is that metaphorical extension uses the idea of the object, i.e. its precepts and rules, as the context of another thing. Adverbial phrases illustrate this process. Walking quickly, working efficiently, speaking loudly. The adverb enhances the meaning of their associated verbs by specifying the conditions under which actions are performed. Now, instead of temperamental or modal modifiers, consider using more elemental modifiers, natural substances, metal, water, or geometrical figures like circles and lines. We use a property unique for each element to conduct a metaphorically extensive proposition. Isn't this such a common literary motif? Science places the essence of substance in its material properties, believing that by analyzing its components, it may retrieve from the carcass of its object its essence. But as Heidegger and Bergson before urged, the true being of something is not to be found here. Strangely, it is found in the relation which that something has with another thing. It's here where something truly acquires and reveals its being. In a nutshell, we need a background against which the concept in question can be represented. This serves the perfect contrast by which to allow the concept to be accentuated. This is explained by the Weber-Fechner law. Psychologist Wundt studied this phenomenon and wrote,
"Everyone knows that in the stilly night we hear things unnoticed in the noise of day, and the stars which are brightest at night are invisible by day. And although we see the moon then, she is far paler than at night. Everyone who has had to deal with weights knows that if to a pound in the hand a second pound be added, the difference is immediately felt, whilst if it be added to 100 weight, we are not aware of the difference at all. The sound of the clock, the light of the stars, the pressure of the pound, these are all stimuli to our senses, and stimuli whose outward amount remains the same. What then do these experiences teach? Evidently nothing but this: that one and the same stimulus, according to the circumstances under which it operates, will be felt either more or less intensely, or not felt at all. Of what sort now is the alteration in the circumstances, upon which this alteration in the feeling may depend? On considering the matter closely, we see that it is everywhere one and the same kind. The tick of the clock is a feeble stimulus for our auditory nerve which we hear plainly when it is alone, but not when it is added to the strong stimulus of the carriage wheels and other noises of the day. The light of the stars is a stimulus to the eye, but if the stimulation which this light exerts be added to the strong stimulus of daylight, we feel nothing of it, although we feel it distinctly when it unites itself with the feebler stimulation of the twilight. The pound weight is a stimulus to our skin, which we feel when it joins itself to a preceding stimulus of equal strength, but which vanishes when it is combined with a stimulus 1,000 times greater in amount."
In chapter 36, the Quran gives an account of the same process using celestial mechanics. In only 3 verses, it explains how perception works.
"There's also a sign for them in the night, how we strip from it daylight, so that they are left in darkness." 637. "And the sun travels or tends towards a fixed term, such as the rigor or exactness of the most exalted, all-knowing." 36:3-8. "As for the moon, we have ordained precise phases for it, until it ends up looking like an old curved palm stalk." 36:3-9. "It's not for the sun to catch up with the moon, nor can the night outrun the day, for each travels in an orbit or course of its own." 36:40.
What we glean from the scheme is no more celestial phenomenon than a mental process, for the Quran lays no distinction between the 2 spheres. Celestial mechanics, for it, is a fixed and exact model showing the morphology of reasoning and understanding. It features the sun and moon, day and night, as modules determining the relation between different faculties of the mind. It first posits the relation between the day and night using the expression stripping, نسلخه, which is appropriate and quite relevant, as we shall see, to the notion of pre-established harmony. If the universe is in fact established, so that everything is formally linked with everything else, so that every element and being has its own allotted place in the grand scheme of the universe, then it makes sense to use an expression like stripping or peeling off to describe the first act of perception, then say forming or coming into contact with, which confirms pre-established harmony as a formal condition. Life and death, hunger and food, wake and sleep, male and female, are all formal conditions and unities before the mind registers any distinction between them in experience. For experience and inexperience are themselves formally united. Experience is a process of differentiation, if not directly between ourselves and our objects, then between the objects themselves. This differentiation is only possible if the things between which there is said to be difference are formally and originally united. It's in this sense that the expression stripping away or peeling off is to be understood. So what modern cosmology calls singularity, expanded through what it calls the Big Bang, is true from a pre-established harmony standpoint. Now it becomes clear from the context which the expression denotes that the phenomenon of day and night signify that first act of psychic differentiation. It shows the phenomena from a first-person perspective. Now turn to the expression darkness, mudlimun, a term used in the Quran in the context of ethics to mean misguided, yet used here to mean darkness. This is a common trait of metaphorically extensive concepts and metaphorical extensity in general, that its concepts should be morphotic and adapted to their context, yet maintaining their essential form. The common denominator between darkness and misguidance is not difficult to see. In the process of understanding or analysis, it's given that what's analyzed or understood should be obscure at first, arcane and shadowy, and by gradual acquaintance and assimilation of the object, we grow more and more informed, and the object less and less obscure and shadowy. Now, does this not emulate the relation between night and day? And does not the process presuppose, as a condition of its possibility, having formally known, albeit not consciously, but ontologically, the object of the experience? This is Kant's idea of the pure concept, which is valid a priori, or simply put, a program containing the general condition under which alone the category can be applied to any object, independently from experience. This is analogous to Plato's doctrine of anamnesis, which suggests, following a similar analytic, that we have knowledge of things before birth, and that in the aptly poetic phrase, all knowing is remembering. Kant, also following this scheme, writes that every sensation has a degree or magnitude by which it can, with respect to the same representation of an object, fill the same time, that there exists a transition from reality to negation whereby the continuous and uniform production of the reality of an object or substance is aptly illustrated in a spectrum, as either a descent from sensation which has a certain degree until it vanishes, or ascent from the negation of a sensation to some magnitude of it. Now it's quite easy to see that the gradual assimilation of an object in experience, being analogous to the gradual illumination of the night by the day, is another scheme different from the first act of psychic differentiation, showing a continuous rather than a spontaneous procedure. This continuum is, as Kant holds, a gradual process of assembly, and the fact that we're assembling means that our object has magnitude. Are we not in the process of assembly aware of the gradualness of the process? And does this process not signify measure, reason, composition? Now it's fascinating, among the many descriptions of the moon, mythological or cultural, we find the measurer. Perhaps a connection can be made between the fact that the moon has phases, namely 8, and that thought and reason is ever a gradual process, where the moon in the analog of celestial mechanics stands for the mind as a sort of measurer or composer of experience. This clearly circles back to C. Newman's idea that some special body in the cosmos must be given as a basis of judgment, as that object with reference to which all movements are to be estimated. Being that understanding, and all its corollaries, imagination, reference, inference, conjunction, disjunction, show a gradual process, we can say that the gradation can only take place on a spectrum, inasmuch as the transitive relation observed between the day and night happens on a spectrum of light, Now we see that both transitions are compartmentalized, that they consist in phases. The compartmental or graded aspect is distinct from the spectrum, and serves, it seems, to designate or modulate it. In other words, what compartmentalizes a spectrum is something other than the spectrum. The Quran uses the term nur, luminescence, to describe the notion of light spectrum. This is owing to the fact that, in a number of occasions, it describes the moon as a luminary, a source of nur, also saying that God is the nur, luminary of the heavens and the earth, which left some wondering why he didn't use something stronger like wahaj, beaming. And the answer is that nur, in its gradients, expresses movement, and therefore guidance and revelation. There is no spectrum without gradation, and what's gradation but a rapid movement amongst points adjacent or contiguous to one another? That is, the spectrum is given only by its various transitive points, and this transition, in turn, gives the perception or illusion of gradual change and alteration. This pertains to the geometrical definition of motion, which, according to Samuel Alexander, is different from how motion is perceived physically. Now, if the number of these phases is, as Hume thought, innumerable, as any spectrometer or color wheel displaying brightness, intensity, and saturation levels, or if you prefer Zeno's racetrack paradox show, why should the moon consist only of 8? The answer is actually given in the verses themselves. It's because what's measured in the context of spectrum is not the modularity and rate of the spectrum, but the modularity of that which grades or compartmentalizes it. Hence why God says that He's the nur of the heavens and the earth. Here He modifies the concept of Himself. Now the Quran gives clear accounts of all 8 phases, and these can be seen in the following figure. The dynamics between these various phases, we believe, are represented in their clearest form in the principles of propositional calculus, in the operations of basic arithmetic, especially when expanded into binary or Boolean algebraic form. Now, addition is simultaneous negation. Negation is a simultaneous addition. One side increases, but only as the opposite side decreases, so that the result is a compromise of both. Now we graduate from this into simultaneous addition and simultaneous subtraction. Algorithmically, this would be 1 0, 0 1, 1 1, and 0 0. Simultaneous addition is multiplication, and simultaneous subtraction is division. Now, if we count the operations of which each side of the spectrum is capable, we reach 8 total operations, 4 for each side. This is where basic arithmetic graduates into propositional calculus, the number of whose operations are 5. In other words, we add individuality to the sum of operations and essentially repeat the same process to obtain the operations of propositional calculus. The conception of substance issues from determinations of this dialectical form. Specifically, when the number of operations reaches a certain number, here 8, as only in 8 do we define the position of x with respect to y, i.e., these operations aim at defining the modules of an operation, i.e., the sides of a spectrum. Empirically, this is impossible to detect, as all we see is the object. Yet, on reflection, it becomes clear that in merely standing in opposition to the object, the same arithmetical principles are being applied in real time. There's you then the object then you together with the object, and you and the object outside of this relation. In Kant, we find that the definition of substance aligns with that of number, and naturally arises out of certain basic operations. Or as he put it, number is a representation which comprises a successive addition of one-to-one homogeneous other. Now, celestial mechanics, as we noted, are ultimately reducible to these relations. Or, let's say, these relations are the Quran's way of expressing them. We find in propositional calculus operations such as disjunction and conjunction, which emulate the relation between the night and day as the Quran describes it in chapter 91, saying that the day unveils and the night conceals. A parallel can easily be drawn between concealing and disjunction and unveiling and conjunction. When trying to understand things, the direction of the scheme is always from negativity to positivity, since we don't have a full sense of the concept that we're trying to understand. The addition side only appears in affirming that movement from negation to addition, or let's say, in successively capturing that movement If asked, why should the Quran use celestial mechanics as a way of representing these relations and not representing the equations of mathematics directly? We replied that the linguistic formulae are themselves no different than the equations of mathematics. They would be equivalent to what Benjamin Lee Whorf described as pattern symbolics. The point of mathematical physics is to describe physical processes, and in this respect it's identical with language. The difference is in the concepts used and the rules that govern their use. And when we look at these Quranic expressions, we find that they describe these mechanics with a precision no less rigorous than a mathematical equation would. If we examine this, we find that the expression of not catching up in the verse to be very consistent with a certain pattern of our reasoning, namely the relation between the concept triangle and the various occasions in which the triangle can appear in experience. Now, the relation between the sun and the moon is highly expressive of this, for the moon is nothing in essence but something which determines, a criterion or rule, which, like the triangle, can never be exhausted in experience, as Kant put it. The idea of rule here is synonymous with the concept of determiner or measurer in general, and as a rule, itself can never be determined except medially through an instance or example. Here the validity of the approximation, frustrated by the magnitude of the concept no less, is equally important. This is the semantic role which the sun fulfills. The sun validates each successive determination, as well as the inexhaustible concept, i.e. the moon, and it's in this relational continuum in which the determiner can only relatively determine, and the validator can only relatively validate that the understanding comes to life, or let's say the faculty of understanding arises from a contradiction. In the context of metaphorical extension, it's virtually impossible, in using a concept like tree, to exhaust all the ways in which it could be used, or all the things to which it can be used, yet its use is only valid in the limitation which it faces on its course. The scheme thus runs: the day and night dynamic capture and symbolize the movement of understanding and reasoning independently of any subject or object. The moon-sun dynamic represents the moon as the mind or subject, or any concept serving as the context as it moves across the spectrum of day and night, and the sun in viewing and affirming the successive steps made by the former. That is, it idealizes the idea of movement and progress, inasmuch as the moon the idea of assimilation or measure. Together they conspire in presenting the image of a moving substance or mind, which is why the sun could never catch the moon, nor the night outrun the day, as the point is to represent a continuum, an infinite substance.